Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining to this new episode of NOVATALKS. Today's guest is Joe Gibson, world-renowned shoulder expert and clinical specialist of the Liverpool Shoulder Unit. Joe, hi, how are you? Thanks for your time and for being here with us in this new NOVATALK episode.
Oh, hi, Geraldo. It's my absolute pleasure. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. So, since in this episode of NOVATALK, we are going to talk about women's role in physiotherapy at the highest level as clinicians and researchers, which have been the key events that have brought to the empowerment of women's role within the PT profession.
Oh, I think that is such a great question. It certainly makes me think. Reflecting on a question like this makes me realise how much the profession's changed since I qualified. So I qualified back in 1987, so I am very old and I've done this for a very long time. And I guess when I look back early in my career, we were still really in that very hierarchical situation where it was very prescriptive what we did, and it was very much led by orthopedic surgeons. And I guess when you look at how things have changed and why we're in a much stronger position now, I think there's no doubt that the advent of evidence-based practice, but also the profession becoming more degree-based within the UK, or certainly these graduate diplomas, gave it a credibility, and certainly autonomous practice was absolutely instrumental as well. And I think really those were the two defining points, because certainly, I guess even when I started training, there was still a perception that it was a job for nice ladies who wanted something to do that they could go back to part-time when they'd had children. And as I say, very much, a kind of caring role, but something that was very much dictated to. And actually, when you look back at that and realise it's only really since the late 70s that we've been autonomous practitioners and then gone on to have degree-based, it's relatively modern that, we've had, I guess, the amount of say in what we do. And so for me, I guess those are two of the key things. One, becoming autonomous practitioners, and two, that degree base, or moving into higher education institutes and having a more robust evidence base for what we do, have really been integral, I think, in terms of being taken seriously. It's really interesting in terms of talking about the empowerment of women's roles within that, because if you look, even certainly in the UK at the moment, 76% of physios continue to be women. So talking about, so we're still leading the way, certainly in the NHS and in hospitals. Maybe it's a little bit different when you look at sport and research and things like that. But I really think that actually, with all its critiques in terms of evidence-based practice, actually that scientific underpinning has been absolutely pivotal to empowering us to be autonomous practitioners, but actually be able to contribute in the research arena.
Among the women you have worked with, is there any mentor or colleague that have made you reflect upon your practice as a clinician or even as a researcher?
Oh, Geraldo, I could spend an hour talking about people and ladies that have influenced me. I've been incredibly lucky in my career, really, to have met and worked with some absolutely amazing people. I guess whenever I'm asked about mentors or colleagues that have really influenced me, there's two ladies that aren't famous, aren't necessarily well known, but were MACP tutors. So I see a major turning point in my career was when I did my MACP weekends and did a clinical placement. And that really was a real turning point for me in terms of developing my clinical reasoning skills. And they really equipped me with, I think, an insight and an ability to, one, critique the literature, but also to kind of justify and reflect on my own reasoning processes, which I guess continues to underpin everything that I do now. So I think for me as a clinician, they were absolutely pivotal, and they're actually my best friends as well now, Fiona Creedon and Janet Wiggins, and they're well known within the MACP world, but they definitely were massively influential in that respect. In terms of research, again, when I think of researchers that have influenced, I remember going to my first ever American conference and walking around and seeing people like Louis Bigliani and Matson and all these names of all the shoulder research, but obviously they were surgeons. But I had a dad who was a psychiatrist, so I was never scared of talking to doctors anyway. And certainly talking to some of those people was they were lovely and very encouraging, but there was still quite a hierarchy at that time in my career. But I guess in terms of as a researcher, I guess Anne Cools definitely had a big effect on me, because Anne's great and she's very direct, and she really challenged me, because I was primarily a clinician, and it was very much, how can you stand up there and say these things and justify your practice if you don't have the research credentials, I guess, to be able to say those things. And I didn't necessarily agree, because I think you need clinicians and people to translate the research, but it certainly made me very, it certainly made me want to do research better, but also make clinically based research a reality. And so I guess, obviously, my kind of interest is within the shoulder world. And certainly when we look at people like Anne and Karen Jin and Jeremy Lewis and people like that, I've been so lucky to meet those people and talk with them and indulge what I think and hear their perspectives. And, you know, the healthiest thing is we often don't agree. So I think female-wise, Karen and Anne have certainly had big influences on me as a researcher. Those girls that I talked about in terms of my clinical reasoning. And I guess another person I'd have to mention is Joanne Elphinstone, actually, who isn't a researcher, but she is probably an artist and a clinician. So I think it's really important to have that balance, because I think evidence-based practice is absolutely about the best available evidence, but it's also about the patient and what they want to believe, and about a clinician's beliefs and knowledge. And I think she isn't afraid to champion the artistry of what we do. And I think that's why it's really important to have lots of different influences. And I guess really I've had different mentors or influences in different aspects of my professional development, but those are probably the people that stick out. But then again, along the way, you kind of gather friends that you talk to over a beer at the end of conferences and where things are at. And certainly Angie Jaggi, who works at Stanmore, she and I have been on a kind of, I'd probably been around a little bit when Angie came on the scene, but she's somebody that, in terms of being mums and wives and the challenges of professional practice and the things that have really made us think differently, you know, when new research has come out, she's been a fantastic sounding board through the years. So I feel incredibly lucky to be able to kind of list all those people and know that they've kept me humble as well. You know, it's not that I always think I'm not good enough, and I always think I've got more to learn. But it's great to have people that challenge you and make you really reflect on what you're doing, so you keep growing as a clinician and a researcher, I guess.
Perfect. And we talked about, you talked about being mom and wife, and considering that you are not only a clinician and researcher, but also a mom and wife, how have you managed to find the work-life balance? Do you have any tips and tricks?
I wish I could say yes. I'm really bad at all of it, and I've never found my work-life balance. I'm absolutely rubbish. It's quite interesting being described as a clinician and a researcher. I think most of my, my research, when I look back, I'm very involved in influencing research and working closely with our research teams. But I think nowadays I'm very much an ideas person. And we've set up these fellowships so that I can facilitate clinical research. But certainly early in my career, when my kids were really young, I'm not entirely sure how I did it, Geraldo, really. My husband worked away at sea. So before we had children, it was very easy because he was away for 6-7 months of the year. So I had a lot of spare time. So that's probably when I did a lot of work in my own time. And anybody who's involved in research knows you've really got to want to do it, because you've got to allocate your own time as well as your kind of employed time. I did a research assistance post part-time for 3 years alongside my clinical role, which kind of gave me the skills. And again, that was before I had children. But once I had children, I still had a husband that was away at sea. So I guess I remember reading papers and doing stuff while I was feeding a kid and doing all these things, thinking, Joe, what are you doing to yourself? And I guess you have to have a really tolerant husband. You have to have some pretty amazing friends, but you also have to be doing it because you want to, not because you feel that you have to. And I quite often get asked by people that, you know, that feel they should do a master's or they should do some research. And you've got plenty of time. You've got your whole career. And so one, you've got to really want to do it, because you can't dress it up. If you're a mum and a wife, there are sacrifices and it's tough. And I'm incredibly lucky to have a very supportive husband who's now retired, so it's even easier because he has plenty of time. But in terms of the kids, there was a lot of guilt, and there were times that I kind of thought that the work balance has always been too dominant. I think my family would argue, but I obviously love it. So I think I have to be honest that it's partly my hobby as well, because otherwise I wouldn't do it. So my advice to anybody who's a wife and a mum and wants to get into research, and particularly if they're doing it as a clinician as well, it is really tough, because I still don't think the model exists that makes it easy. So you've got to want to do it, and you have to find a way of creating time. And I think what I've got better at is allocating time for the family and being resolute that doesn't get infringed on. But I would be lying if I said I'd got it right, because I really haven't.
Okay, and touching upon gender medicine and physiotherapy, have you ever experienced any difference among patients' expectation when they have been treated by a female or male physiotherapist?
Oh, wow. That is a really interesting question. I certainly think I've had instances where I haven't perhaps been the person somebody thought I was going to be. And I'm not sure that was so much about me being female, though it probably was female and age, actually. Certainly when, if I go and see patients when I'm lecturing abroad, and people have been told they're going to be seen by this international expert, Joe Gibson, I think they expect a man, some young man who's full of charisma, and then in walks this middle-aged lady who's got lots of wrinkles and he's very middle-aged, and you can kind of see them look and think. And I've certainly had a couple of young guys where you could see by their body language that was an issue. But in terms of my everyday work, I think I have to be honest, in my NHS work, I don't wear uniform, and I think that gives me an advantage because people perceive me as being different to maybe a physio they've seen, and we did an audit that proves that was the effect. But in terms of being male or female, I think that when I've experienced that's been more a cultural thing. So we obviously have lots of different ethnic groups. We're a city centre hospital, and I think there's certainly some ethnic groups where the hierarchy in terms of male female is still very, very dominant. And so me being a female is an immediate barrier. But I think if you read people's body language, that's usually pretty obvious pretty soon. But I think it's an important point that you make, because I think sometimes, as whether it's being male or female, we just sometimes have to accept that we're not the right person for that patient. And sometimes it does need somebody else. I think probably sport is one of the toughest arenas, again, because there's a lot of men in sport, and depending on the sport that you talk about, that can be more of an issue, because there are still some fairly outdated beliefs about who should be doing the role in certain sports. But I don't think I would ever let it be a barrier unless I genuinely believe there was a cultural belief behind it that meant I was never going to be the right person. So I guess in answer to your question, I have experienced it, not very often, but I think it's okay to accept that sometimes you're not the right person, because much as I would love to change thousands of years of cultural beliefs in certain ethnicities, I'm not going to be able to do it. And first and foremost, I want patients to get the best deal. So if I'm not the right person to deliver that, then sometimes I've got to take that on the chin. If it was in sport, I probably wouldn't accept it. I would probably push very hard to show that I'm absolutely the right person by getting the results that I would expect to get.
Yeah, by the way, talking about sports, I remember when we met in Liverpool at your private practice 2 years ago. Yeah, it was 2 years ago in August. I remember that there were a lot of Premier League professional athletes shirts exposed in your clinic. So how did you approach as a female in the Premier League to treat their professional athletes?
I've been incredibly lucky. I've only had 2 negative experiences, and they were very early in my career, probably when I wasn't as recognized myself in terms of my own expertise. But I'm an endless optimist, Geraldo. I just go into these places with a big smile, and I'm very conscious that I'm going into an environment where the physios there have responsibility for these athletes. So what I'm massively conscious of is nothing I do is aimed to undermine them or try and show that I'm clever or better or whatever, because I'm not. I just happen to have an expertise in a particular area. And certainly within professional football, you know, the instance of shoulder injuries is relatively low anyway. So clearly they don't have the patient mileage to see lots. But I have to say my experience of them is the amount of research and work they do to upskill themselves when it's necessary is absolutely awesome. So it's about building a relationship with the physiotherapist so that they absolutely believe that I'm on board, and I always take time to understand absolutely everything that's been said to the athlete by the coach, the manager, the physio. And the physio is my kind of information gold mine, if you like, to make sure I know what the story is, because whatever I say and whether I agree or disagree, how I then deal with the athlete is governed by the language that's already been used. And I think probably because I've done that, I haven't come up against much resistance. Sometimes I might have a difference of opinion in terms of the strength and conditioning, or perhaps the focus, and you know, in professional sport that, you know, footballers particularly have so many different influences and people that they rely on who may have some really wacky ideas. And I think it's where...
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. And so again, much as sometimes it's tempting to kind of go, don't be ridiculous, I never do. You know, I just try and find a common language where we're all working together. Now, you know, you're always going to get the egos, and unfortunately in football, you know, there are more egos and more money, and people have so much invested in these things. But I actually think I'm really lucky because I go in as a consultant, and everybody has a very clear expectation of what my role is. So I think just being sensitive to the politics, the environment, and the multi-messages these poor athletes get, and building up relationships with the different clubs, I've been incredibly fortunate, really. As I say, the only negative experience I had was very early on when I had a goalkeeper that actually came to me rather than me. I mean, I couldn't do that now anyway with all the insurance restrictions. And this is literally 25 years ago. And he was doing really well. And then he rang me up one day and said, oh, the club physio says there's no point me seeing you anymore because you won't be able to get me better because you don't understand football. And I was absolutely fuming, and nobody had spoken to me. And I remember speaking to a colleague who worked in football, and he just said, but that guy's had treatment for 6 months and not got better, and now you're getting him better. That puts the physio in a difficult position. And at that really was a very valuable lesson. And that's why from then on, I absolutely wouldn't see anybody without knowing the physio in charge and knowing everything that had been done and said, so that I wasn't then introducing a kind of conflicting opinion, if you like. And also, whenever I go in, they've always done good work. So it's just about saying, well, look, you're doing all the right things. We just need to look at how to bring it together differently. So I'm in a very fortunate position. But I do think it's that communication that's probably allowed me to do it without upsetting anybody tremendously.
That's fantastic. And what advices would you give to younger colleagues who want to succeed in their professional life as clinicians and wants to stay up to date with the latest evidence as well?
Oh, so I think it's really tough because there's so much blooming evidence coming out. I mean, if you look at they quote thousands of papers a year, and there's just absolutely no way you can keep on top of it. I think this is where social media is absolutely brilliant when we talk about the research side of things. You know, if you have a particular interest, it's really good to try and highlight the researchers and clinicians who have key interest in that area, because certainly on Twitter and Facebook, you see this constant posting of really kind of good papers or influential papers, and that in itself provokes a discussion. I'm very lucky in my role as a university lecturer in that I have access to databases and I can get most papers, but I do think those are great starting points. What I would say to young physios is that for me, having good research appraisal skills is key, so that you can actually appraise the literature, because again, I was very guilty of the old abstract scan and the exciting summaries, and then reading the paper thinking, oh dear, that isn't necessarily telling me what I thought it told me. So there's no doubt that having those skills is absolutely key. I think really, much as my answer to that last question, I think research skills, using social media to shortcut some of the work or at least signpost the areas, not being afraid to read around as well, not just sticking to your specialty, because when I look at the things that have helped change my direction or make me really reflect on my practice, it's by reading in other specialties, or going down a line with a particular interest and seeing where it's taken me. God, I feel like a politician. I've gone massively off piece there, sorry. Ask me the question again, because I think I've gone slightly off kilter there, sorry.
Those advices that you want to give to maybe younger colleagues that are curious on how to succeed and manage at the same time the professional life as clinician, and they want to stay up to date with the latest literature or evidences. This was the...
Okay, cool, sorry. Yes, I definitely went off off target.
No,
so I think what I said at the beginning is definitely true. I think social media, one of its most useful things is actually being able to signpost some really key research, and that's great. I do think having critical reflection skills and being able to appraise papers is a really useful skill, because you will very quickly realize how, I have to confess myself, is that we all have our biases, and much as we try and be grown-ups and suspend those biases, it's very difficult to do that when you're reading research. So it's very good to follow people often with opposing views, so you get a more balanced introduction. And I think the most important thing is there is so many groups now, like NICE and the Cochrane and various groups that are producing guidelines that summarize a lot of the evidence. So, again, if you have a key interest, it's knowing the best places to go to get those summaries, and some fantastic online resources now as well, again, that will shortcut it for you. So I think it's easier. I think I'm involved with a group called MSK Reform in the UK, which is really pushing employers to try and allocate specific time for clinicians to do research, because obviously a lot of our clinicians are based in the NHS. That's not a reality yet. Certainly in my institution, they talk about it a lot, but it's still not happening. But I would just say allocate some time, but get the skills to do it efficiently. Otherwise, you can waste a whole lot of time reading a whole lot of research that actually is a very poor methodology, and you've not given yourself the best time. But I think the other thing is you've got to enjoy it. Don't be reading stuff that doesn't interest you. Whereas, because if you start with the stuff that interests you, it will then take you on to other things that build that story. So I think there's lots of different ways, and you also have to recognize the best way that you learn. Because for some of us, podcasts and other people summarizing the research is actually a better way of signposting reading that's going to be relevant. So I guess recognize how you learn, recognize what you're interested in, and allocate some time for it. Don't feel under pressure that you should be doing it all the time, but you certainly need to fundamentally have the skills to be able to do it well. So I guess that's, for me, I'm just really, I love what I do. I'm really interested in it. I don't want to ever stop learning, and that's what motivates me to read, I guess. But I do find that social media is the thing that kind of sends me in different directions these days.
Thank you, Jo. Okay, thank you for your time and being with us in this NOVATALK, in this new episode of NOVATALK. And thanks to everybody who is watching this NOVATALK episode. Meet you on the next episode. It was Jo Gibson from Liverpool, Upper Limb Unit, and Raldio Malia from NOVAVIA Project. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.